The Economist had a cover story this week called "Israel Alone." It really is so sad that every utterance and every move made by the Israeli government is under a cloud of suspicion, and that isn't helping the talks. And also, it's enabling the world to continue to ignore the fact that, however objectionable they may feel that Israel's actions in the war might have been, Israel's facing this monstrous entity that wants probably the war to continue. Some people think Netanyahu wants the war to continue. Maybe he does for political reasons, but I'm sure Hamas does. When Gazans are killed, Hamas is happy, not sad. When Israel, as Smotrich did today, announces more settlement in the West Bank that will continue to enmesh Israel in the Palestinian areas and take Israel towards a future where it's a half not Jewish country and not a democratic country. And this is presented as a punishment to the Palestinians. Hamas receives it as a gift and not as a punishment. So everything is backwards, and nothing here will make any sense until there's political changes on both sides, I fear.
All right, so we'll be back in a second. And meanwhile, a U.S. resolution urging a ceasefire in Gaza linked to a hostage deal has been vetoed by Russia and China in the UN Security Council, extending a 5-month impasse in the international body over the Israel-Hamas war. Your response to this veto by China and Russia?
Well, they called it a hypocritical spectacle because the U.S. had hoped that this would be seen as, to a degree, that it would be seen as a little bit of pressure on Israel. But it really wasn't, because in calling for a ceasefire, along with the release of all the hostages, the resolution stated the obvious. I mean, there clearly won't be a ceasefire without a release of the hostages, and vice versa. So the main thing about the resolution, I think, was an effort by the U.S. to signal that to show some daylight between themselves and Israel, in the very fact that it wasn't coordinated with Netanyahu. And you see here,
it was more of a way of distancing from,
but ever so slightly, without any content to back it up. So miscreants though Russia and China may be, I find myself agreeing with them. There wasn't a real resolution. I think.
What does it even mean by vetoing it? I mean, there's no.
Well, it just means the UN isn't calling for the obvious, which is a ceasefire and of undetermined lengths and a hostage release. I think greater pressure is coming. There are going to be meetings in coming days in Washington, and it's very, very clear that even though the U.S. does support the ultimate aims of going into Rafah and finishing off Hamas, not as a concept or as a political party for all time, but in Gaza, they do not support this without a grander plan, and they have presented the grander plan. And the Israeli security establishment more or less agrees that there needs to be a day-after plan in which some version of the PA is restored to Gaza.
Is somebody actually behind the scenes working on a day-after plan? Because we've been saying this for months. You know, first the Prime Minister, we can't work on day-after.
Several weeks ago, the government presented some farcical non-starter of a plan that, depending on clans in northern Gaza, which would be a mafia state that Hamas would take over again in about 3 seconds. Israel doesn't seem to be working on a plan. And the U.S. certainly is. The U.S. and the Europeans and the moderate Arabs would very much support a grand scheme that would involve talks on a two-state solution that can last forever, basically. The PA being restored to Gaza, and a strategic alliance between Israel, Saudi Arabia having normalized relations with Israel, and other moderate Arabs, and the U.S. and the West against Iran. Now, this is a basket of goodies for Israel. And that Netanyahu rejects this is a strategic failure of colossal proportions. And I do think he's rather isolated. So again, I said before, everything is under suspicion of being part of a political machination. In this case, Israel appears to be rejecting this logical way out, which would buy it legitimacy for the operation in Rafah, which does need to happen. I think quite possibly because if the government agreed, the far right would leave the coalition, and it would bring down a government. You'd have elections in 3 months, and Netanyahu would lose those elections. He would then face his bribery trial without the position of prime minister, which he can use for stalling tactics. Now, this is vulgar, and I'm not proud of even suggesting such thinking on the part of the Israeli prime minister, but it may very well be the most likely explanation.
All right, Dan Perry, thank you very much for your analysis. As always, have a good night.